Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Tamara Sanderson. Now, Tamara is the co-founder of Remote Works, business that she set up with her partner, Ali, and they've written a book by the same name. And it's a really fascinating book. It's interesting that the work, when we talk about remote works, sounds as if it's something that has just been written, based on COVID experience and post-COVID experience. And in fact, their work actually predates COVID by quite an amount. So this is really kind of taking it before COVID, and right up to date, and it's been published this year. But we talk a lot about that, the issues and the concerns that organizations have and their battle to find the right balance, but also how leaders need to shift their own style and how they need to adopt their own style into a working environment. And it's not just a cut and paste and we go from in office to remote. And also how managers can really get that balance right between giving autonomy and also supervising, where supervision is beneficial and is really helpful. So it's a very interesting conversation. We talk about fatigue, we talk about burnout, we talk about all sorts of topics that are very, very topical in the current climate. And you will certainly find Tamara a very, very interesting and fascinating and energetic contributor to the podcast. So please sit back and listen to the very interesting Tamara Sanderson. Tamara, thank you so much indeed for joining me here on the Winning Teams. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Well, look forward to this chat. You're the co-founder of an organization called Remote Works, where your promise is that you are going to liberate people from the 9 to 5 and teach them how to do their best work anytime and anywhere. That's a big promise. So how has it been in terms of fulfilling that promise?
You are right. It is aspirational for sure. I think we started with ourselves. So Ali and I are both liberated from the 9 to 5, and we know that it's possible. And within our book, we talk a lot about different ways for organizations to unlock that secret. But I wouldn't say everybody's, liberated from the 9 to 5, or else this book would be not.
Well, absolutely.
It wouldn't be very interesting.
No, or also you'd have run out of clients. So
yes.
So wait, when you say liberate from 9 to 5, what do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, we mean working on a more nonlinear schedule. So, and what that looks like is we often talk about going from like a high school model of working to more of a university model of working. So we're all adults, but for whatever reason, it feels like we're back in 9th grade a lot at work, or at least in the traditional industry. It's butts and seats, 40 hours a week. You have a teacher, you kind of go, somebody's supervising you. You have a very structured work, you do what somebody tells you. And so it feels very prescriptive and not in a place where it can meet a lot of different people's needs. So that structure works really well for a certain portion of people, but that can be very debilitating for others that don't necessarily work in that structure. And so instead, we recommend people moving more to a university model where a professor on the first day of school will give you a syllabus, they'll set expectations, you'll know what you're going to be reading. Maybe you come in twice a week, you have a lecture, you may have a tutor. You know what is supposed to be delivered by the end of the semester, but you're not having that professor call you all the time and asking like, hey, where are you? What are you doing? Are you at the library? Are you at the library? And instead, we really think that removing the 9 to 5 means treating people like adults and that they can get their work done appropriately when those expectations are set.
Yeah. So, I mean, you started your work prior to COVID. So you've been doing this, for quite some time prior to COVID. So it's not a COVID initiated piece of work that you're doing. But I'm just curious in terms of, because obviously it's very topical. So you're publishing a book about remote work is very timely. But as I said, you do kind of predate COVID. I mean, what are you hearing about this kind of great debate about kind of remote, hybrid? what's the mix? What's the right balance? What is it? What is your take on what's happening? Because there's so much debate about it, and companies are being honest, as you know, probably better than I do, are struggling with it.
Yeah, so actually the reason we wrote this book was when myself and Allie, who's my co-writer, we realized that remote was actually a skill set. And that was actually during COVID when people were really having a hard time transitioning, because it was very intuitive for Allie and I as remote workers. So before the pandemic, we worked for two of the most prominent all remote companies. So I was at Automatic, which is WordPress and Tumblr. Allie was at DuckDuckGo. So it was kind of second nature for us. And even before then, I worked at Google, which is an in-person culture, but we use so much, we used, a lot of like GVC and email, and it was a tech company. So I was very fluid in using tech as a main part of my workflow. I also worked in Singapore, so I was working a lot with different countries. So it was very natural to, work with people that I had not seen before. Same as when I was a management consultant before that. So it was very natural to me. And I felt very, very liberated the more and more I got into remote work. And so when the pandemic happened, people were transitioning, and I saw that people were on calls for 6 to 8 hours a day. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I was at a company and they wanted me to be on calls for like 6 hours a day. And I was like, oh, this is awful. And it felt like we were just copy and pasting the same things from the office and doing it at home. And yes, it's nice to be able to work from your pajamas. It's nice not to commute, but there's so much more that you can do with remote work if you're thoughtful. And people were just transitioning really fast. It's like moving house and you're giving like half a day. You know what I mean? Like you would do it really sloppily. You would just like try to get all of your stuff just moved as fast as possible. But for a huge organizational shift, you have to put a lot of thought and rethink your structure and your foundation of your organization.
And what are the things that, I mean, because as you say, I mean, most of the organizations, if they were told, prior to COVID, that, you're going to have to move everybody to work online next week, they don't say that's impossible, but actually it did happen, right? And they made it happen. But obviously, what you're saying really is that what we're doing is that we were replacing the in-office work and just bolting on technology to it, but we're doing the same thing. What are the things, and I know it's the benefit of hindsight, but what are the things that we should have done differently in terms of making it kind of fit more into what you see as being the ideal way of approaching it?
Yeah, so this is an easy blame, but I think meeting-oriented management is a bit of the culprit in a lot of this. I think meetings can be great. They can be really lovely and productive. They can also just be for forming relationships. You can have a great one-on-one and feel seen and heard. You can really communicate messages. But a lot of organizations, the entire glue that runs the company is meetings. And so it's almost like you're always in a game of telephone, talking back and forth to different people and restating things, and having a lot of your intellectual capital kind of just disappear after people leave the meeting room. And it's also, people are only, they can only remember, but only so many people are in that meeting. If you only have 4 people of your organization, that's 1,000 people in a meeting. That's not many people that have that information. You're relying on people to remember it. Most people forget things. I think 70% of things within one day and 90% within a week. And so there's just so much leakage of thought within an organization. I think what remote work does, it forces people to be really thoughtful about documentation. And so that rather than relying on it all existing in somebody's head, that it exists and it's written and somebody else can look at it regardless of if they were in that meeting, if they joined the company a year later. And that was something I found really amazing when I joined Automatic, is I actually went from a company where a lot of stuff kind of disappeared after we talked about it. We moved on to new things and we forgot different things, et cetera, to a company where everything had been documented since 2004. And I felt almost like omnipresent, because I could like search for anything and know exactly what had happened throughout the company's history. And that was amazing, because I actually, when I joined Automatic, I was able, we worked a lot with my former team, and I could actually read stuff I didn't even know at my previous organization through my new company, which was like very weird, where I was like, oh, that's what Alex was up to. I had no idea. And so I think that can be really, really powerful as an organization. And it's just like a really good habit to have.
So what you're talking about, the leakage, and I agree with you. I think that the amount of time that is being spent at meeting is unproductive, and we know from our own data that that's true. But that's the problem. How do you solve it? How do you go about changing that? That we're not going wall to wall meetings, that we're not having this talking heads all of the time. That's a big shift to make, and organizations, as you know, are truly struggling with that.
Yeah. I would not necessarily want to be the person in charge of a really large company that has this behavior as a part of their DNA, because it is a lot of remote work is actually behavior change. It's not about using a new cool tool. It's not about getting on Zoom or Slack or whatever. A lot of it is about your behavior change. I think the first thing I recommend is, rather than think about what you're going to do for the entire company, think about it from a team level. It's much easier to crack how are 5 or 10 people going to reduce the amount of meetings they have than like how is a company with 50,000 people going to change
Right.
this entire culture. But with that, the first thing we recommend is just a meeting audit. So go through your calendar of the last month and start seeing which meetings you had, which ones were needed, and seeing ways that you can kind of just switch what you're doing. So for example, if it's a status update meeting and it was just like you're giving information to people, could that be a written update instead of being a meeting? Let's say you have a meeting that happens once a week. Maybe it could happen every 2 weeks instead. And then also see which meetings are really working, which ones are really engaging, and are you doing a lot of interesting things, and learning from those great meetings, and how can you replicate that in other ones. So I think just learning and trying to reduce the amount of meetings you have is like a great first step. And then I think from a company-wide level, you really need to start thinking about your knowledge management and documentation processes. Because unless there's another way for people to easily communicate, they're going to continue to do meetings because it's the easiest method, is just to let's get on a call.
Yeah.
And
you also have the kind of the cultural thing is that, it's FOMO, it's fear of missing out, right? So I go to the meeting, or if I'm not invited, why was I not invited? What's going on? Why was I excluded? Right.
yeah,
So,
it's like a
so you,
party.
yes, so you have all of this sort of thing. But I want to lean in just to what you talk about in the book Remote Works. And one of the concerns that a lot of people talk about in terms of remote working is losing team culture, that
Yeah.
it diminishes, or it's very difficult to create it, or it's very difficult to sustain it, or it's very critical to shape it. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah. So the way I stand on it is, I think all of it is a case by case basis. So I definitely hear this within the internet world about remote work. I think it can be true. I would ask people to think through more about what is culture. So culture is not a ping pong table. Culture is not a happy hour. Those are nice. Like, I like to go to a company happy hour. Actually, I find it very fun, but I know for some people it might be very draining, or people that do not drink, it could be isolating or ostracizing. So I like to think of culture more as, I was a digital nomad. I was a big traveler. I was an expat for 9 years. I've been to 70 countries, which feels very ridiculous now that I'm very static here in Boston. But I think of culture like going and traveling somewhere else. And so if you're going to somebody's team and you're going into their team culture, so you get into their documents, you get into the meetings that they have, maybe the offsites they have, the way that they work together, it should look different than other teams across your organization from like an anthropology perspective. And so they should have like different rituals. They should have different ways of speaking. Maybe they have different colloquial terms or inside jokes. Maybe they play like a really short game at the beginning of every meeting. Maybe on Slack, they do a poll every week of like, what's your favorite book, or different ways to get to know each other. So you should feel like you're in a different place. And so we actually recommend, once I'm sure you're familiar with this as kind of a team expert, but there's like 5 stages of team development that all end in ing. So it's like forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning, which all rhymes, which is very nice whenever you're trying to come up with some type of framework, right? But we recommend, once you're in that forming, performing stage as a team, to start codifying what you're seeing and what's working. because there's something, you're in two different frames of mind. When you're just like working and doing things, you're in this active state, you're not necessarily reflective. And when things are working, you want to take a step back and start reflecting on what are these behaviors and norms that we're seeing that are really working and are interesting, and start codifying that as a behavior that your team has. And so we say, put this in a team charter. And so this could be things that are included, like, what are the words and symbols that represent our team? What are our team rituals? How do we document? How do we like to collaborate? Even you can have like pictures of when was the last time you did an offsite? Like, what are, if somebody's new to the team, how can they quickly, find a TLDR on like what the team does and what they've been accomplishing? So you start putting all of those together, and then people start feeling more cohesive, like they are in a culture. And I think one way to think about remote culture is also just to think about internet culture. The last, 20, 30 years, we've been in this like wild experiment of different subcultures on the internet. Reddit looks very different than Instagram. That looks very different than TikTok. And those are all subcultures on the internet. And so you can also create subcultures within remote work, and they should not look all the same.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is that I think it's in many cases, I think actually we take the easy way out and blame remote on the fact that the culture isn't good, instead of actually thinking about how can we go about doing it in a way that's really meaningful. And I had this conversation with somebody recently. I said, "Well, what was your culture like before COVID, when everybody was in the office?" And, well, it wasn't great. Well, it wasn't great then. So
I think about that a lot. That's funny because like people are always like, I miss the water cooler. And I was
yeah,
like, nobody told me that.
yeah.
Nobody told me how much they love the free water at a company. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So there is a little bit. The one area that I just do have I must admit I do have a question mark in my own mind about it is if you're doing something that is kind of creative thinking, or you want to get into that kind of blue sky creative, bouncing ideas around the place. Do you believe that, and there's something quite magical about getting people in a room to do that, because you bounce off each other. Do you believe that you can replicate that virtually?
Yes, and so I think you can replicate it virtually, which I'll talk about. I also think if you're an all remote company, there's still benefits of coming in person every once in a while.
Yeah.
So if you are, for example, when I was at Automatic, we had team meetups that we would self-organize twice a year in different places. For my smaller team, that was about 5 or 10 people. And then would have a larger one for all of Automatic. And I would often go to tech events. So Google I/O, F8, WordCamp, and I would see people in person. So I do think those moments, I got a lot of energy and I felt excited, and we would like ping those ideas off in like a social, fun way. And so I do think that's really important to create momentum. That being said, as somebody that is a creative, I don't necessarily think that the meeting with all the post-it notes is the only way to be creative. So as an example, I co-wrote a book, which is a creative project with Allie. We came up with a lot of our own frameworks and ideas. We use archetypes that are all on musicians. We interview tons of people. There's a lot of puns and games and quizzes within our book. And we did that completely remotely. Allie lives in Europe and I live in America. And so we had not seen each other for over 2 years, and we saw each other after the book was written. And so that is a creative process that you very much can do remotely. And I know it to be true. But I would say like you have to be intentional. So I was a designer at IDEO, which is known for design thinking, and it is a very creative firm. And so I always think of the process of how do you go wide with a team, and then how do you converge on different ideas? And so I was talking to my friend Jared, and he had an interesting way of doing this. He runs a startup in Canada that does a lot of stuff in crypto world. But he was telling me that he basically, let's say they're designing, I don't know, a new look and color of their website or their product, right? Rather than just get in a meeting and start bouncing off ideas, he'll have people do little research projects before they come in. So they already have some thought in what they're going to share, like a show and tell with the team. So what I recommend is if you were going to do that kind of project, everybody is in like these different locations. So why don't have people like find something that's inspiring in their local area and then bring it to the team. So if I was looking at how we're going to change the colors of our branding, I would have somebody go, I would probably go to, there's this beautiful Athenaeum, which is this awesome library that I'm a part of in Boston. I would take a lot of pictures, and it would be this kind of old, like, I don't know, Boston has a very specific look and feel because it's one of the first cities in America, right? And there's like a lot of like old things, and I don't know, statues and like old textiles. So I would take a lot of pictures like that. And so that look and feel would be very different if somebody was coming in. Maybe they're like, I was in nature, I live in Utah, and they're coming in with like all these pictures of like red rocks and blue sky, right? And so we would come in very different aesthetics, but we would have something to show and tell on Zoom, and then be able to discuss like, oh yeah, I love this and this, what if we did this? And so I really recommend, from a creativity standpoint, of using what you have. You don't have necessarily that verbal pinging off ideas casually in a hallway as easily in remote. And I completely agree with that. That being said, you can structure thought that really helps people be creative in a individual way and a group way, which is helpful for people that might be more introverted or think creatively in a different way than in a group setting. Because sometimes you get this hippo effect where it's like highest paid person's opinion ends up dominating or group think. And I think you can get away from some of that with remote work.
It doesn't mean that you can't mix the two anyway, doesn't it? I mean, you can do a combination, which can work very well. In your book, you talk about, which I'm really interested in, about how leaders need to adopt their management and leadership style to reflect this new way of working. Can you just maybe elaborate on that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so I think this even goes to one of your points you brought up earlier. But so much is about behavior change, which also means modeling that behavior. If a company can tell if your leaders are not on board with remote work or hybrid work, if they're always in the office, if you know that the way to get promoted is through proximity and FaceTime, you're not going to have other people really want to adopt remote work that want to be a leader within that organization. So I really think the leadership team, the management team, they need to be the first people to model the type of behavior that they expect from their teams, because it will just naturally happen. And I hear this a lot. So I was talking to somebody the other day that was talking about being a product manager at a remote friendly company. But realistically, they knew that at the headquarter office that they still had, you had to be in person to be a part of any important decision, to get FaceTime, to get promoted, to have anything happen in your career. So it wasn't really remote friendly in that way. And I think I actually recommend people to frame it more as an inclusion and a diversity concept. If you have some employees that are remote and some that are in person, if you're giving preference and favorability to the people inside the office just because they're there and they live near you, then I would say that's like a form of discrimination. And so to start thinking through, like, how can you level the playing ground between your employees that may live in different places? But to go back, it's all about modeling behavior. So I think the reason like Automatic worked so well was Matt, who actually wrote the foreword for our book. He started WordPress and Automatic. His name is in the title of Automatic. It's spelled with 2 T's. But he did not want to be in an office when he started WordPress. And he also started, he co-founded with somebody that lived in a different country than he did. And so I think because the roots were all by nature distributed, it made the company that way. And so I came from Google. I love a Google Doc. I still love a lot of the Google products. I still have an Android phone, for example. And sometimes I would keep like secret Google Docs at Automatic for my own thoughts before publishing it widely on WordPress blogs. And Matt found that out one day and he was like, hey, get it out of that Google Doc. That is not what we do. We post it on WordPress blogs so everybody can have access. And I was like, okay, so when the CEO tells you that, you automatically, post really quickly on the WordPress blog and you don't do that behavior anymore. But I actually think by him both modeling that behavior and also enforcing it, it causes this culture where everybody is incentivized to follow the transparency that is needed to run a remote company.
The other thing that is interesting that you talk about is because there is this, when you talk about remote, it is about the autonomy, but there's also, I mean, and it's not a word I like, but there's also a need to kind of supervise. I don't mean that in the sense of being over some, but there is actually a need to do it because you need to help to train, to develop, to coach, all of that sort of thing. How do you get the balance of those two right without kind of tripping over one or the other?
Yes. So that is a really good point. There is a friction and there's a tension, which I think is really important. And I think a lot of what we're hearing when people complain about remote work, what they're really complaining about is loss of control and also having to change, which are incredibly uncomfortable for human beings. And if you look in any wisdom or religious tradition, they talk a lot about that being a difficult
Yeah.
thing. I would say, so with autonomy, you want to train employees to be able to be their own project manager and to manage their own workflow. And so that is the autonomy that you want to see from them. As a manager, though, you step rather than being like a micromanager or dictating every little small part of their workflow, you end up start supervising at a bit of a higher level. Higher level as in like a like almost on like a Maslow's pyramid. You start
Yeah.
being an actual coach, a mentor. You start being really intentional with like setting the framework of what your team, what you want your team to accomplish. What is the vision? What is that North Star? You start being a lot more strategic because you need to be able to guide that team to accomplish those goals on their own work style plan. And so I
Mm.
do think it is difficult for both managers and employees to start transitioning, but once you have, I think you unlock so much power of giving everybody to the ability to work at their full potential.
Yeah.
Within our book, we have 4 different ways to start like flexing your leadership style. And we named them after like fun band types. So we have like the composer, the band leader, the agent, the promoter. We talk about K-pop and like the fifth Beatle. So there's a lot of stuff with like cultural references, but there's also flexing. So if you have a team that nobody's ever worked remotely, and let's say this is their first job out of undergrad or out of high school, you're really not gonna want to give them too much autonomy. It is like training wheels with a bike,
Yeah.
or like kids that have like floaties before they're like swimming laps. You want to give them little bits of freedom as you go along. And the more that they're able to handle it on their own, you give them more. So it is like a path, a
Yeah.
progression. And so we always talk about flexing your style. You can be way more hands off if you're like, I have a bunch of independent contributors that have 20 years of experience. They're awesome at their job. Like let them do them. I'm just going to unblock like issues in the organization so that they can do their best work. And I'm going to get them the resources they need. We need more budget. We need more of this, dot, dot, dot. I want to give them, more ability to be seen in the organization. So as a manager, you may be like acting very differently than somebody that has a more junior team.
Well, yeah, and I think, Tamara, what you're saying is that there isn't a one size fits all answer. It depends on the who, it depends on the what, and it depends on the stage they're at in their own career and their own development. One of the things that you do talk about, and this does come up, as you know, quite a bit, is that a lot of people have been experiencing burnout, and certainly I think for many managers, it's been difficult enough to identify in a remote world that burnout is actually taking place. You talk about it in the book, and you talk about how you can identify signs of it. And I'd love you to share with the listeners how to do that.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. First of all, I think there is an always on culture that happens the second that you introduce technology into your organization. And so I have been at organizations that have had a lot of technology since I started my career in 2006. I remember within the first 6 months, I became a management consultant that gave me a BlackBerry. And at that moment, I had an electronic leash that I did not realize, and I was getting notifications all the time on the weekend. It was also a culture that worked 70 hours a week, and that was like a kind of a norm within the organization. And so it was an always on. And so I've experienced lots of burnout throughout my career, even in like a traditional organization, because of that always on nature of work. And so what I would recommend is in this new world where people do have more technology and they might not have those norms of when they're allowed to be offline, I think you need to be really prescriptive about giving people the ability to say, not now, later. Not everything is a fire drill. Not everything has to happen immediately. You don't have to respond to every ping. And we recommend we recommend a lot of asynchronous communication, which means not simultaneously. You don't have to be on at the same time. It's later communication. But with that, you should give people outlines of what you're expecting. So we have like 4 W's, which are like Who's responsible for responding? What is the context behind it? When do you expect an answer by? And if nobody responds to this message, there's like, we call it want want. It's like, this is what I'm going to do anyways if you don't respond. And so by having that framework, it allows you to be like, okay, I sent this message. I'm giving them 4 days to respond. I can put it out of my mind. And then by having that wah, you don't have to go like herd all the cats. If nobody responds to your message and you say, this is my plan, if I don't hear back, you can keep moving forward. And so I think really simple little strategies like that unlock you from that. I have to be on, I have to always like be on alert to see if people have responded or not responded. So those are some things I would recommend. I think with noticing burnout, there are things you can see with like how people are responding on messages. So how are people even coming into a meeting? Are you seeing that their facial expressions on Zoom are like really low? Are they not contributing as much? Are you noticing they're not doing much stuff in your project management system? Has the way that they type changed? Are they not using emojis? I also think in general, there's this cultural phenomenon going on right now where people are actually accepting and it's a norm to say that you might be burned out. And I think part of that came with the pandemic because a lot of people became very burned out in that moment together, and it became more socially acceptable. I'm actually a fellow in psychoanalysis. And so I think a lot of this from a psychological perspective. And I think burnout is normal. And I think when people are burned out, it's not to just quickly fix something so that they can get back to normal. Often there's something like not connected. When I have felt the most burned out is because I did not feel like what I did mattered at all. And so I think in our book, we talk a lot about a framework that's a little bit loosely based on Maslow's hierarchy, but how can you make people feel like they're connected to their work, they're connected to the mission statement, that they matter, that they're learning something, that they're mastering something at work. Once they feel more included, I do think that reduces some of the burnout because there's more inspiration of why they're there.
So, I mean, that could be a topic for a completely different podcast interview, but I'm just curious. So are you saying that not all burnout is as a result of just being exhausted, but it's actually some of it can be just because I feel disconnected?
Yes, for sure.
All right.
And so even when people are talking about burnout, I always like to dig in it. Again, this kind of goes to, it depends on the who and the context and all kinds of things. By talking about burnout at large, it kind of reduces something that is actually incredibly personal. And you could just be burned out because you can be burned out for so many reasons.
Right,
and it can also have an influence of like, maybe there's a lot going on in your personal life at the same time that your work life is happening. And so what is the impact of both of those on you? And you're going through a period of change. Like I always look, my brother has 4 really cute young children, and I am a very active auntie. And so whenever I see them, like Reagan would get so tired when she was learning to read, and she would just be like, my head hurts so much. And, like we're learning so many new skills right now with remote work. It's fun. Like burnout might just be like, I'm exhausted from trying to learn differently. And maybe you just need a break. I'm all for breaks. So we talked about this concept called the 3 M's in our book about micro, meso, and macro breaks. I'm also a big fan of people taking sabbaticals. If you're feeling incredibly burned out, find a way to actually be able to lean into it. Because I tend to feel when we have these extreme emotional reactions, they're for a reason. It's like our body is trying to tell us something. So by just trying to push through burnout and be like, okay, I'm going to come up with some way to trick my brain into being more okay with what I'm doing. I think you're not really getting into the root cause of like, why are you feeling so depleted?
Yeah, well, that's the old story. Don't bury it and just kind of plow ahead, isn't it? And find a way to compensate for that. Tamara, this is fascinating, and I'm sorry I have taken you for longer than I said I would, but it's been really, really interesting to have the conversation. Before we wrap up, and you can tell people where they get in touch with you and how they can buy the book. 2 questions I have for everybody. One is a book other than your own, and that has made an impact upon you. What's the book and what was the impact?
Yeah. So this is a really hard question. I am a huge reader. I read probably 4 or 5 books a week. I'm
Wow.
obsessive. It's my favorite thing to do. I have a giant home library now that I have a physical space and I'm no longer a nomad. I would say what comes to mind, I really like Eric Fromm. And so he is a psychologist from, I guess, the 1950s. He wrote a lot on freedom, which is something that I'm
Right.
really into. He wrote some things on love. I just like love that he wrote a lot on the corporate person and like how corporations were impacting how we thought about the world and marketing. And so I just love everything he writes and I find it really relevant to the work world. So I would recommend Eric Fromm as my author, and he has multiple books, so I can't pick just one of them.
Okay.
And yeah, but if anybody wants other book recommendations, feel free to always ping me
You're
on LinkedIn. I have a million book recommendations depending on kind of your mood and what you're looking for. But I would also just give a big shout out for books over other mediums. As somebody that has written a book, and you just spend so much time as an author thinking through what you're going to put in these like 200 pages. And so if you're reading somebody's book, know that that's years and years of thought and energy that went into it versus a social media post, which I do a lot on LinkedIn right now. But I get an idea and I write it in 5 minutes, which is very different than when you're writing a book.
It sure as hell takes longer to write the book than it does to read it. That's for sure.
Yes, for sure.
And second question, daily rituals, if you have them, what are they and how do they help you?
Yes. So I guess number one is definitely coffee. So I am
Right.
a huge coffee fan. Since we have a whole part of our book that talks a lot about energy management, my new ritual is now knowing that my chronotype, which is scientific, we actually talked with a lovely professor at Berkeley, and she told us a lot about different chronotypes, but I am very much night shifted. And so my rituals are much more aligned with my natural biological rhythms. I
Mhm.
wake up later, I go to bed later. I'm okay with taking a midday nap because I know that it will help me be more productive. So my rituals are a lot around working with my energy versus against it. I used to always try to be a morning person because you would hear all these podcasts and people would be like,
Yes.
oh, I have this great ritual. I wake up at 5 a.m. and I
Yeah.
get started for the day. And I was like, oh my gosh, I am so not that person. And I would try to be. And then I would feel awful all day long trying to do that. And so now that I've really leaned into my natural rhythms, I'm just a lot more productive. So I think that's part of my ritual. But yeah, I don't think I can go without coffee. So that's
All right.
definitely
Okay.
number one for sure.
Tamara, this has been fantastic, and I wish you continued success with your book that was published earlier this year. I've no doubt it'll be a huge success. Where can people get the book, and where can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, so the book is distributed through Penguin Random House, which means it should be available all around the world, but the easiest place to get it is on Amazon. So you can go there, you can get a Kindle audiobook, physical book, or you can go to our direct publisher, which is Barrett Kohler, and you can buy it on their website. But lots of great tips in there. We talk about a lot of the things that we discuss on this podcast, but it's very choose your own adventure. We give a lot of frameworks and reflection questions, lots of stories, but ultimately we really hope this is a playbook for you to find your best way of working. And it does not have
That's,
to look like mine, and it does not have to look like Allie's.
well, listen, that is fantastic. Tamara, thank you again so much for being a guest. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to coming back and maybe doing a second one.
Awesome. Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara.